Hello and welcome to another tutorial in the CSS series. In the previous tutorial, we spoke about what the selectors are and the types of selectors by which we could target the HTML elements to apply CSS styles. In this tutorial, let's talk about few more different techniques of using selectors. So the first three that we covered in the previous tutorial all fall under a category called as simple selectors. The next type of selectors that I'm going to be talking about in this tutorial are called as combinator selectors. So we have already seen that simple selectors are of three types, and then the combinator selectors are of four types. So let's try to understand what a combinator here is. A combinator is a technique where we use one or more simple selectors. That's why it's called as a combinator. We use a combination of one or more simple selectors. Uh, for example, let's talk about the first combinator selector. I think it's very easy to explain it using an example. So let's start with the first one. It's called as Descendant Selector. A Descendant Selector uses parent and child relationship between HTML elements to add styles to the descendant of a particular parent. So for that, let's try to come up with some examples. So I added a div tag here or a div element. Within that, I added a paragraph element. Let me give some content in between these paragraphs. So let's call this is a descendant paragraph. Let's go back to our HTML page and then hit refresh. We can see that the newly created paragraph has been added. Now, what if I want to target this paragraph element using its parent? So let's see how we can do that. So I'll be adding the parent tag information. I'll give a space and then it's followed by the child tag name. Now I could give a color to this. Let me hit save, go back and refresh. The color has been applied to the paragraph, which is the child element of div. So why do we have to do that? We could have chosen to directly use a paragraph here and then give it a style, or we could have added an ID or a class name like how we have done in the previous tutorial to style this. Definitely that is one of the few ways uh, to style the element. But there could be scenarios where you want to style the all the elements under a parent to behave in a certain way or to have certain stylings. So that's when we could make use of the descendant selector technique. So let's dive a bit deeper into the descendant selector. Now, what will happen if I add in another HTML element? Let's say I've added a section and then added a paragraph in this level. Let me call this is a descendant nested paragraph. Now I'm going to save this, but before I go back to the browser, let's think about this. Is P, this paragraph, a descendant of div? Yes, I think so, because section is a descendant of div and P is a direct descendant of section, which means P is a descendant of div. So this style should be applied to the paragraph, to the nested paragraph. Let me go back, hit refresh. Now we can see that this has been applied to the nested paragraph as well. Now let's go back. Uh, so this is one way to target all the paragraph elements to behave in a certain way uh, by making use of a specific parent. So the other technique here is, if I have an ID, let's say I have an ID to this uh, called div1, and I only want all the paragraphs under this particular div to have the yellow green color, then I'm going to update this descendant selector to have div and then a pound symbol and give div1. So what I'm telling here is, select a div which has an ID of div1 and then find a paragraph child within any paragraph child within a div which has this div1 ID, and then give it a yellow green color. So when I save this and go back, there shouldn't be any difference. Now if I add another div outside of the div with an ID div1 and give it a paragraph, so I added another div and then added a descendant paragraph to that div, and then I saved this file, went back and refreshed. So as you can see, this did not have the styling that we had here. But if I remove the pound div1 and then hit save, this is going to be applied to all the divs, all the paragraphs which are under a div. So it's going to add the style to this paragraph as well. So let's check that out. As you can see, this is another paragraph. This paragraph is here, but it's still under a div. So the selector has selected this element as well and then applied the styling to it. So that's the difference between a regular selector versus a combinator selector. Uh, let's move on to another type of selector here. So let me add it back. Uh, uh, let's restrict this styling only to the descendants of a div with an ID div1. So let's move to another type of selector, which is called as child selector. All right. So let's think about this now. Within the child selector, let's say I have uh, okay, so within the child selector I want to have the paragraph. Let's say this is parent and child, right? The paragraph should have a specific style here, uh, but this should be applied only to the immediate child. So the difference between a child selector and the descendant selector is, the descendant selector will apply it to any level, which means it applies it to any nested level. Let's say I have 20 divs with one within another and then have a paragraph within that 20th div. Uh, by this definition, it should still apply the color to that innermost paragraph, uh, this particular style. Whereas if I add a child selector, so let's add a child selector. So the way we add a child selector is, we give a div and then we add this greater than symbol, and then we provide the child tag name. Within this we could add a color, uh, some color, which is like some light color here to differentiate it. So I hit save. Now let's think about it. So it's going to target a paragraph of uh, which is a direct descendant of a parent div. But if we look at it, it's going to apply, it should apply it to this paragraph, but as well as it's going to apply it to this paragraph. Let's check if that is true. Okay, so it did not apply it to this paragraph because uh, it has this style has overridden the current child selector definition. I'll go into why that has happened in the future tutorials, but just keep in mind that this ID, anything with an ID, takes in a higher precedence, which means it's going to overwrite this styling with this styling. So for now, let's only focus on this div and paragraph elements. So within this, it has applied this color of azure. Now, let me add a nested uh, section and add another paragraph within this other child paragraph. So let me save this, go back. So in this particular case, it shouldn't apply the azure color to this paragraph because it's not a direct descendant of the div. So child selector only applies to the direct descendants. So let's go back and then refresh this. As you can see, it did not apply it to the nested child. It only applied it to the direct descendant. So that's how the first two categories of the combinator selectors, they depend on the parent and child relationship. It could be the immediate child or it could be a descendant or a nested child. So that's the difference between these two. So I'll be talking about other two of the common combinator selectors in the next tutorial.